Picture this. You're crouched beside a fire somewhere in the highlands of Central Asia. It's roughly 2,500 years ago. The night is cold enough that the fire isn't optional, it's survival. Someone tosses a handful of dried plant material onto the hot stones beside the flames. A thick, sweet-smelling smoke rises up, and everyone leans in, breathing it in deliberately, on purpose, like it's part of the ritual. That's not a scene from a modern festival. That's an actual archaeological reconstruction based on real residue found on real burnt stones, thousands of years old. So here's the question. When did humans first start doing this on purpose, not stumbling into smoke by accident, but actually choosing it, seeking it out, building entire rituals around it? The answer turns out to be older, stranger, and far more universal than most people assume. And getting there means digging through fire pits, frozen tombs, and one of the most unexpected discoveries ever pulled out of the ground in the American Southwest. Before there's smoking, there has to be fire, so let's start there. Controlled use of fire by early humans goes back roughly 1 million years, with strong evidence from sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, showing burned bone and ash deep inside cave layers dating to that era. For a very long stretch of human history, fire was about three things: warmth, protection from predators, and cooking food. But here's something worth sitting with. The moment humans started deliberately burning organic material in an enclosed space, caves, shelters, gathering spots, they were also, whether they realized it or not, inhaling smoke regularly. Every controlled fire produces particulate smoke, and that smoke contains compounds released from whatever's burning. Wood, resin, bones, and, almost certainly at some point, plants with psychoactive properties growing nearby that occasionally ended up tossed onto the flames out of curiosity or by total accident. This matters because it sets up the real mystery at the heart of this video. Inhaling smoke wasn't new. What's new, what we're actually trying to date, is the moment that smoke inhalation became intentional, when humans started picking specific plants because of how the smoke from them made them feel. There's a compelling theory among some anthropologists that humans didn't invent smoking through careful experimentation. They stumbled into it. Imagine early humans cooking over an open fire near wild-growing plants that happened to contain psychoactive alkaloids, certain wild tobacco relatives, datura, even early cannabis family plants in parts of Central Asia. Toss enough random vegetation onto enough fires over enough generations, and eventually someone notices that smoke from a particular plant makes them feel different. Lighter, calmer, strange, maybe even a little disoriented in a way that felt significant rather than accidental. Once that connection gets made, even once, it changes everything. You're no longer just burning fuel. You're burning a specific plant for a specific effect, and that's the actual birth of intentional smoking. The accident becomes a discovery, and the discovery becomes a practice. The problem, of course, is proving any of this happened a specific number of years ago. You can't carbon date a feeling. You need physical evidence. Residue, burnt seeds, charred plant material in a context that makes it obvious this wasn't just cooking. And for a long time, that kind of evidence was frustratingly thin on the ground, literally. Then, in 2019, researchers excavating burial mounds in the Pamir Mountains, a brutally high-altitude range straddling modern Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and China, found something that changed the conversation. Inside wooden burners recovered from tombs dated to around 500 BC, scientists detected high concentrations of cannabinoids, the active compounds in cannabis, on stones that had clearly been heated. This wasn't wild hemp growing nearby and accidentally getting burned. The chemical signature suggested plants specifically selected, possibly even bred or cultivated for higher THC content than typical wild cannabis. In other words, roughly 2,500 years ago, people at high altitude in Central Asia were deliberately burning cannabis, almost certainly as part of funeral or spiritual rituals, and they appear to have been doing it with plants chosen specifically because they produced a stronger psychoactive smoke. That's a remarkably sophisticated practice for something happening 2.5 millennia ago. It implies generations of accumulated knowledge about which plants worked best, passed down deliberately, refined over time. But here's the question that should immediately come to mind. Just because the oldest confirmed physical evidence dates to 500 BC doesn't mean that's when the practice actually started. It just means that's the oldest evidence that happened to survive, get discovered, and get correctly identified by modern science. Absence of older evidence is not the same thing as evidence that something older doesn't exist. Around the same era as the Pamir burials, the Greek historian Herodotus wrote about a nomadic people called the Scythians, who lived across the steppes north of the Black Sea. According to his account, the Scythians used small tents and heated stones to create vapor from hemp seeds thrown onto them, and would sit inside inhaling the resulting smoke, apparently for both ritual purification and recreational effect. Herodotus wasn't a chemist or an archaeologist. He was a traveling historian recording second-hand accounts, sometimes mixed with exaggeration or misunderstanding. Historians have debated for centuries how literally to take his descriptions. But what's striking is how closely his account, written roughly 2,400 years ago, matches the physical residue evidence found in actual Scythian-adjacent burial sites centuries later. A written account and a chemical analysis, separated by thousands of years and originating from completely different methods, arriving at the same basic picture. That kind of convergence is hard to dismiss as coincidence. So by this point in the timeline, we've got strong evidence that intentional plant smoking rituals existed across Central Asia by at least 500 BC. But cannabis isn't the only plant in this story, and the next chapter takes us to an entirely different continent. Tobacco, the plant most people associate with smoking today, has a completely separate origin story, rooted thousands of miles away in the Americas. Genetic and archaeological evidence places the domestication of tobacco somewhere in South America, likely in the region around modern Peru or Ecuador, with cultivation spreading northward over thousands of years through Central America and eventually into what's now the United States. Indigenous peoples across the Americas developed elaborate ritual and ceremonial uses for tobacco, smoking it in pipes, chewing it, even using it in enemas in some documented cultures, almost always tied to spiritual practice, healing ceremonies, or important social and political negotiations rather than casual, everyday recreational use. When European explorers, starting with Columbus's voyages in the late 1400s, encountered indigenous Americans smoking tobacco, they were witnessing something most of them had genuinely never seen before: a deliberate, ritualized act of inhaling burning plant matter for its mental and physical effects. Within decades, tobacco made its way back to Europe, and within roughly a century, it had spread across the globe, transforming from a sacred ceremonial substance into something closer to a casual commodity, smoked in taverns and traded across continents. That global spread is well documented. But it raises an obvious question that took archaeologists a surprisingly long time to answer. If tobacco was being formally cultivated in South America for ceremonial use, how far back does the actual practice of smoking it go? Centuries? A few thousand years? The answer, when it finally arrived, blew past every previous estimate. In 2021, archaeologists working at the Wishbone site in Utah's Great Salt Lake Desert published findings that genuinely stunned researchers across the field. They recovered 4 small charred pipes, modest, simple tubes carved from bird bone that tested positive for nicotine residue. Radiocarbon dating placed these pipes at approximately 12,300 years old. 12,300 years. That's not a typo, and it's not a rough estimate with massive error bars. That date pushes intentional tobacco smoking back roughly 10,000 years earlier than the previous oldest confirmed evidence, placing it deep into the Pleistocene era, a time when much of North America was still emerging from the last ice age, when humans were still actively hunting megafauna like mammoths and giant ground sloths. Even more interesting, the specific tobacco species detected in the pipe residue wasn't the same domesticated species used in later, more formal ceremonial tobacco cultivation. It appears to have been a wild tobacco variety, smoked long before anyone had gotten around to selectively cultivating it into something easier to grow or more potent. In other words, humans were experimenting with intentionally inhaling wild, undomesticated psychoactive plant smoke over 12,000 years ago, well before agriculture existed in any recognizable form, before pottery, before most of what we'd consider the building blocks of civilization. This single discovery essentially rewrote the opening chapter of smoking's history. The practice wasn't an invention of settled, sophisticated societies, with their boring fires and their pipes. It was something hunter-gatherer peoples were already doing, deep in the Ice Age, using whatever wild plants happened to be available and effective. So why would early humans, already managing the constant demands of survival, hunting, foraging, avoiding predators, bother going out of their way to seek out psychoactive smoke? One compelling explanation, sometimes called the intoxication hypothesis, suggests this drive isn't uniquely human at all. It might be a deep evolutionary impulse shared across the animal kingdom. Consider elephants that deliberately seek out and eat fermented fruit, sometimes to the point of visible intoxication, or reindeer in parts of Siberia that actively seek out hallucinogenic mushrooms, sometimes even drinking the urine of other reindeer that have already eaten them, apparently chasing the second-hand psychoactive effect. Researchers like the late pharmacologist Ronald Siegel argued, based on decades of observing animal behavior, that the drive to seek altered states of consciousness isn't a human invention or a cultural quirk. It's something closer to a fundamental biological drive present across many species that humans simply expressed through fire and smoke rather than fermented fruit or mushrooms. If that's accurate, then ancient humans weren't smoking despite the difficulty of survival. They were smoking partly because of it, using altered consciousness as a release valve, a brief departure from a genuinely brutal daily existence, the same basic impulse you can watch play out today in an elephant raiding a fermented marula tree. Beyond ritual and recreation, ancient civilizations across multiple continents independently arrived at another use for smoke entirely: medicine. Ancient Egyptian medical texts describe burning various herbs and inhaling the resulting smoke to treat respiratory ailments. Classical Greek physicians, including writings associated with the Hippocratic tradition, documented therapeutic smoke inhalation for conditions ranging from coughs to more serious lung ailments. In ancient India, Ayurvedic medical traditions described herbal smoke treatments for a wide range of conditions, some of which persist in modified forms today. What's notable here is the independence of it. These are wildly separated cultures, with no meaningful contact, arriving at strikingly similar conclusions: that controlled inhalation of burning plant matter could serve a medicinal function. That kind of convergent discovery across unconnected societies suggests something more than coincidence. It suggests that smoke inhalation genuinely does produce noticeable physiological effects, real enough and consistent enough that completely separate civilizations, working independently, kept landing on the same basic idea. There's also a less obvious angle here, one rooted less in chemistry and more in human psychology. Smoking, across nearly every culture that practiced it historically, tended to be intensely social. Pipes passed around a circle, communal tents filled with shared smoke, ceremonial ritual involving multiple participants rather than solitary use. Modern neuroscience offers a plausible explanation for why this pattern shows up so consistently. Shared sensory experiences, particularly ones involving mild altered states, tend to strengthen social bonds and group cohesion. A shared fire, shared smoke, and a shared altered mental state created something close to a synchronized group experience, reinforcing trust and connection among people who depended on each other for survival. Seen this way, ancient smoking practices weren't just about chasing an individual sensation. They were functioning as a kind of social technology, binding groups together through a shared ritual that happened to also feel good. Here's where this story takes a noticeably darker turn, because the same basic human impulse that produced sacred Scythian funeral rituals and Ice Age experimentation eventually collided with industrial capitalism, and the results were considerably less spiritual. By the early 20th century, cigarette manufacturers had transformed what was once a deliberate, often ceremonial practice into a mass-produced, heavily marketed commercial product, engineered for maximum addictiveness through manipulation of nicotine delivery and content. Internal industry documents, later exposed through litigation in the 1990s, revealed that major tobacco companies had understood the addictive and carcinogenic properties of their products for decades, while publicly denying it, deliberately targeting advertising at young people, and suppressing internal research that contradicted their public messaging. It's a strange, uncomfortable bookend to this story. The same basic human behavior, intentionally inhaling smoke from a burning plant, traveled from sacred Ice Age ritual, all the way to one of the most well-documented cases of corporate deception and public health manipulation in modern history. Back to the original question. When did ancient humans start smoking? Based on the Wishbone site discovery, we can say with reasonable confidence that intentional tobacco smoking existed in North America at least 12,300 years ago. Based on residue analysis from the Pamir Mountains, intentional, possibly cultivated cannabis smoking existed in Central Asia by at least 500 BC, and based on the broader pattern of controlled fire use stretching back roughly a million years, the actual original moment, the very first time a human deliberately inhaled smoke from a chosen plant because of how it made them feel, almost certainly happened earlier than any physical evidence we currently have, somewhere lost in the deep, unrecorded stretch of prehistory that archaeology hasn't reached yet and may never fully reach. We don't know the exact date. We may never know it. What we do know is that this wasn't a single invention by a single culture at a single moment. It happened independently, in different forms, on different continents, using different plants, separated by oceans and tens of thousands of years, which suggests something less like an invention and more like a deeply rooted instinct, expressing itself wherever humans found fire and a plant worth burning. Which means that somewhere, right now, the descendants of those same impulses, the same basic drive toward altered states, toward shared ritual, toward a brief chemical departure from an unforgiving world, are still very much alive. They didn't disappear. They just changed shape. And if you've ever exhaled slowly and watched the shape it made in cold air, you've echoed something humans have been doing, in one form or another, for over 12,000 years.